Should you be memorizing your music? Well, I think that a lot of the time, yes, that's a really helpful, important thing to be doing, but in some situations, no. And I'll explain exactly what I mean so that you can figure out what you want to do when you're starting to learn something new. First off, I think it's well worth memorizing and really internalizing your songs and pieces because apart from anything else, when you've memorized it really well, it just feels good to play. It feels like second nature, a lot more effortless, like you just know it and aren't having to really do work to remember it. And when you're not having to use all your brain capacity on trying to remember it or reading the sheet music whilst you play, thinking hard about what notes come next, what fingers to use, then your mind is much more free to actually focus on how you're playing it. Focus on the performance and really listen to the sound of what you're doing. Then you can think about all the little details that make it sound great and be more musical with it and put more expression into it. Even when you've just memorized the notes themselves at first, that leaves you much more free already to focus on all the basic technique stuff you have to think about, the fingers and the movement, and you can work on that without stuttering and pausing every 5 seconds because you can't remember what happens next, or read the notes quick enough. But then with more time, you've also been rehearsing all the technique too, so that becomes automatic. You're aiming to memorize all that stuff as well, and when you get to that point, that's when you feel much more in control and steady, and then you can focus on the more artistic stuff and less about the craft. It's a skill to work on, memorizing stuff. I did create a video recently I'll link to below which has some really actionable practice methods you can use so that you can learn to memorize those pieces that you love that you really want to play well. If you're not a reader and you're learning music off YouTube and things, then you do really want to focus on getting good at memorizing. For me, I usually like to memorize most things that I learn, but you have to make that judgment based upon what your learning goals are and what you're trying to actually work on when you're learning something new. Especially when you're going to learn something more challenging, all your focus wants to be on the practical side, on the technique and things. So you don't want to bog yourself down trying to process all the information from the sheet music at the same time. And then of course, as a beginner, there's likely going to be a lot of material that you want to play that you can learn to play, and you can figure it out from the sheet music, but it's too hard to be able to read quick enough to play and read together. Maybe there's lots of ledger lines you're not used to yet, lots of flats and sharps, and in that case you want to just learn and memorize it bit by bit. You shouldn't limit everything that you play on piano to the same level that you can read and play at the same time. So I say that use your judgment, but most of the time, when it's your main repertoire, a piece that you really want to play the best you can, or when it's something that you're learning to specifically develop your technique, then learn to memorize it so you can really focus on the practical side of playing it. Earlier, I said that you should try and make a judgment based on what your learning goals are. So a time when you wouldn't want to actively try and memorize your music is when you're specifically working on your reading skills. Now maybe that's one of your main goals to get good at reading, but even then I would simply have some pieces where that's what I'm going to do and others where I'm going to try and memorize it. Because I think most people want to avoid ending up where they can only play piano if they've got sheet music in front of them. Obviously with sight reading, you're playing something at a certain level where you can read it at first sight, you're not going to be memorizing it. But also, it's good to work on some pieces that are harder than that you couldn't look at and read and play first time. But with some practice, you can read and play together. And that's a good way to push your reading level. You may end up memorizing little bits here and there, and that's okay because when you're doing this and you kind of know what's on the sheet, you're really getting this connection between the notes and the rhythms on the page and how that directly translates to the piano, and you're learning to do that faster. Just don't specifically try and memorize it too much like you would otherwise, because you may find yourself switching off from reading and then you're not focusing on what your main goal is. And with this, it may be good to try and be playing different music often to avoid that happening. And I just want to point out that when you are at a high enough level of reading and you're reading something that's well within your comfort zone, you don't have to put much energy into that, so you can then still focus on all the technical stuff. Just as a beginner, that's not normally the case. You often want to be playing something that sounds better, that's going to be too hard to read quick enough. With classical piano pieces, for example, we're normally trying to play them note for note, so you either have to read it or have it memorized. But in lots of other settings, maybe you're playing chords and things in a band, or there's an element of improvisation, you're going to memorize things a little bit more loosely. So you might remember the chords and the kind of rhythms and the kind of style you're going to play in. And there might be some really specific parts to learn too. And by the way, we can use things like chord charts and make notes on the structure to help remind us. Some musicians are going to be reading on stage as well. It depends on the musician and on the situation. But when you're more comfortable playing by ear, playing around with chords and improvising a bit, then often what you play won't be exactly the same twice. And you've practiced playing around with them, so you've got comfortable with the kind of things you can do for that song. You know roughly what you're going to do. But at that point, it's actually much easier to memorize things. Just familiar with how to do that stuff, the elements of the musical language, and that's what this channel focuses on a lot. The stuff that's going to help you recognize what you're playing, learn quicker, learn better, and that's going to help you memorize things way more easily. Anyway, check out this video next for those really important practice methods to help you memorize your music. Thanks for watching.